This
Michelle.
conference will now be
hmm
recorded.
All right. Hello, everybody. As Michelle said, my name is Scott Bjorklund. I'm a park ranger at the Lake Superior Maritime Visitors Center in Duluth, Minnesota. I've been here for about 5, coming up on 6 years this year. And during that time I've been here, I've actually gotten some awesome opportunities to go along with the Coast Guard as they're doing icebreaking operations in the harbor. So as a result, I've created a program for you guys on Great Lakes icebreaking, the importance that that has with the shipping industry, and just kind of a history behind it, how it came to be, and where we're at today with modern icebreaking operations. Before we get started, just a couple of things. I have some small interactive portions to this. So, for those of you who are watching, if you could do me a favor and just interact a little bit by using the chat when I ask for it, that'd be great. And then there's going to be some videos towards the end of the program where I actually have a few videos showing what happens as you're ice breaking, what it's like being on the icebreakers. So, the video might not come through very well for you guys depending on your connection, but if you go back on the recording later on, you'll be able to see that video a little bit better. And there's plenty of ways to see this kind of thing on YouTube as well. So we'll go ahead and get started here with the presentation. So, a little bit of an outline. First, I'm going to start by talking about lake ice formation, mainly on Lake Superior, because that's where I'm stationed at. This doesn't necessarily cover all the Great Lakes, and understanding where the big ice areas are, I can give you a pretty good overview, but mostly detailed on Lake Superior. How the Great Lakes icebreaker evolved over time, from small local craft to specifically ships being built just for that purpose. And then the modern stuff, what happens today with icebreaking with the Coast Guard is Operation Taconite, and I'll be talking about that as well towards the end. So before we get into ice breaking, I just wanted to bring into some perspective here. One way you can kind of look at this entire subject is think about how snowplows help you in your home area, especially if you're in Duluth or Sault Ste. Marie, where you get a lot of snow during the winter. Snowplows are pretty much, you can't survive without them in the winters up here. So I kind of want you guys to think like, how do snowplows not just help you, but help semi trucks and the economy move? Things can kind of grind to a halt easily if we're not able to drive, if buses aren't able to get to where they're going to bring people to work, or semi trucks delivering goods and railroads. So icebreakers are kind of similar for Great Lakes shipping. They keep things moving when ice is a huge issue. All right, so the Great Lakes shipping season, some of the basics. So, what a lot of people don't realize is that the shipping season lasts most of the year. Um, that starts on March 25th for Lake Superior and ends on January 15th, and that all happens surrounding when the Soo locks close up for winter maintenance every year, and that's what those two pictures show, is the winter maintenance happening, where they actually dewater the lock to do work on it for those 2 months. And since most of Great Lakes shipping comes up to Lake Superior, to my neck of the woods, um, that's pretty much when most of the Great Lakes shut down for the winter for shipping. Some shipping does occur pretty much all year round, especially with the tankers out on Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and the Canadian side of shipping down there, and salt deliveries and such. But most of the shipping does shut down once Lake Superior gets shut down from the rest of the Great Lakes when the Soo locks close up for every winter. And people, because they don't realize how long the season operates, winter conditions can get pretty severe for ships that are operating, especially those that operate on the lower lakes further in the winter. That picture there shows just how awfully cold it can get up here. We can easily have temperatures going into -20, -30 range, well just before the end of the shipping season, which causes a lot of ice to form. So that's when it's really important to have the Coast Guard and the local tugs in our harbor to operate. And what's really cool is, as you can see with this picture, is that ships get covered in ice. They look really neat as they come through, but ice can be a huge issue as they're trying to plow through it to get to the docks that they're going to deliver their cargoes. And of course, the crews, as a result, have to deal with that cold too. They're out on deck dealing with ice and snow, awful conditions. But that happens every year, so they're pretty much used to it. All right, a little bit on ice coverage on Lake Superior. So, Lake Superior, since that's the furthest northern Great Lake, I feel that we get the most, not always the most ice coverage, but we definitely get a lot of ice build up every winter. It can kind of vary. As you can see from some of the data I have here, from the 70s through the last decade, the average kind of ice coverage has been going down, but we've been having more recently some extremes of anywhere from 100% ice coverage one winter to very low ice coverage the next. So, if anything, overall, on average, the ice coverage has been going down over the last several decades, but it's been becoming more extreme where some winters will get a lot, other winters will get virtually none. And this picture is one of my favorites of a satellite image taken um, in 2019 towards the end of that winter when almost 95% of the lake was covered in ice. And that spring, there was a lot of work that had to be done with the icebreakers, getting the ships through to our port in our area. And there was a solid ice shelf about 20 miles outside of us that was a foot or two thick, which is pretty amazing. With how big Lake Superior is, especially with volume of water, it takes a long time for ice to form because of just how much energy and warmth the lake holds. But once it gets cold, it can almost cover up the entire lake. All right. So, talking about the lake versus our harbor, again, ice can vary year to year, but for our harbor in particular, we almost always get ice just because of how well protected it is. It starts to form in the November December time of the year, and that's when our Coast Guard units start to operate. And it's about at its height by February or March, and that's about the time the shipping season starts up again. So that can be a problem. And we've had some years where ice can kind of stick around until May, or even longer than that, depending on how bad the winter was. This last year, I think we had ice until May, if I remember correctly, because we had a pretty rough winter last year. A little bit on the best ice forming conditions. So you need consistently really cold temperatures typically for ice to form pretty quickly. You know, below zero. Obviously, you need any temperature just below 32 degrees, but the colder the better. A little to no wind. So Lake Superior, because it's so huge, wind can be a thing. So ice formation can be kind of stopped if it's constantly windy on the lake. But once certain areas get iced over, that can definitely help with ice buildup. Um, the very open parts of the lake can not necessarily always get ice coverage because of how windy it is out there. And then cold water. So, like I say, by February or March, the water temperature of Lake Superior is at its coldest. So, that's the best time for ice to form. So, a little bit of an interaction portion. I actually gave away the answer to this already, but can anyone tell me, especially based off of that picture, why do you think our harbor, anyway, always has ice coverage during the winter when it gets cold enough? If anyone wants to use the chat and answer my question, that'd be awesome. And I'll give you a minute, see if anyone has any ideas. Yep. So, yep. Thank you, Steve, for the answer there. So, getting into a little bit of what I was talking about. Yeah, exactly, Michelle. Sheltered water. So, if you look here with our harbor, we have a very long peninsula that kind of keeps our harbor waters protected from the wind mostly. So, almost always, and since, like I said, you need little wind for really good ice formation, so almost always this interior area of our harbor gets covered in ice every winter, and the Coast Guard gets to deal with that both at the start of the shipping season, or at the end of the shipping season, and at the start of it. And another thing to keep in mind too is that our harbor area is more shallow than the lake, so it's easier for our water temperatures to get colder because of the shallower areas. The shallow areas are kind of more affected by temperature during certain times of the year. So, getting into the Great Lakes shipping side of things, how did we deal with ice breaking before they were icebreakers? Well, it was really hard to deal with. Back, especially in the late 1800s, we're dealing with vessels that are smaller, kind of underpowered. Wooden vessels are very at risk of getting punctured by ice. So basically, when ice would form on the Great Lakes, they would shut down shipping. That which is usually in the November time, and then it would start up again in April or May, depending. Steam powered ships had a better time of getting through ice, but the sailing vessels were pretty much in big trouble if they got stuck in ice fields and stuff like that. This photo you see here was taken off of Duluth, the 1890s, and this was kind of a classic image at the end or start of the shipping season where you'd see a bunch of ships stuck in the ice, and usually they would need assistance by local vessels that have better ice breaking ability. Um, and as time went on, once ships became built of steel and iron and had more powerful engines, that's when normal lake vessels could handle ice better, but it wasn't always enough. And even in the early 1900s, you still, even with those more powerful ships that are made of steel, they still struggled. Especially, we have some famous photos here from 1917, just off of Duluth. That was a really busy time for shipping because of World War One. And if you can believe it, it actually says June 6, 1917, and there's a huge ice formation just off of Duluth. Thankfully, that isn't that kind of ice formation sticking around until June isn't as um, common anymore, thank goodness, because it actually feels like summer at that point. But it wasn't uncommon to see a lot of ships being stuck off of the piers here at that time of year. And then another famous photo, it's kind of hard to see, but this is the famous 19, I believe, 26 ice blockade where a ton of different ships got stuck at Sault Ste. Marie at the very end of the shipping season because of how rough and cold it was. That ice built up quickly, and we just had a ton of different ships that were stuck there over the winter that had to be broken out later on. So, one of the ways they could deal with some of the ice issues was having local ships help with that. That could be tugs or any smaller vessels that are built of iron or steel. A famous example of this for Duluth, anyway, was the tug Record, which was built in 1884. This small tug was actually built as an icebreaker specifically of iron, um, and it served as an icebreaker up here in our harbor for several decades, helping with assisting vessels and getting in and out of the harbor when there were bad ice issues. And you can see here on the left, here's a picture of them with one of the other tugs breaking ice in the spring. Um, and on the right here, you can kind of see as these tugs are moving through thick ice, their bow will kind of come up onto the ice, and then with the sheer weight of the hull, they can break through it as the vessel kind of breaks down onto the ice. As I was reading about this vessel, what was kind of interesting was they actually filled the bow and stern with concrete, so it was just really heavily. It was just very heavy, so it could actually break through the ice that way. And it had a very powerful engine. And like I said, it was built specifically for ice breaking. And we'll get into a little bit of how those kind of design features are used with official, more ice breaking, larger vessels that were built later on. And that scene is still seen today. When the Coast Guard is not out there in our harbor operating, the local tugs are usually asked by the shipping companies to break out slips, yeah, or through the two entries that we have, and that's pretty common. You usually see them out before the Coast Guard has to go out to do more major ice breaking. And here are two of our local tugs, the Missouri and the North Carolina Great Lakes towing vessels. And I believe, I think I was looking at marine traffic, the spar is supposed to be out ice breaking today. So if you later on want to go on to Duluth Harbor Cam and look at the live cams, you might be able to see some of the ice breaking in action. So building up to the what we have on the Great Lakes today with the Coast Guard icebreakers, a lot of this goes back to the experiences of this one particular captain named Nathan Boynton, and he famously sailed on the Great Lakes for many years. And there's a famous story where he, as he was captain of the steam propeller St. Paul, which you can see on the right, he had to get into Alpena, Michigan, which was on Lake Huron, and the port was famously not being, it wasn't accessible because of the ice late in the season. So Captain Boynton got the idea that if he were to take his vessel and strap it alongside another ship, um, in going the opposite direction, his plan was to use the other ship's propeller to both help both ships back up so that they can ram into ice, and to help those the propeller would be used to chop up ice as they're backing up. And he was successful. He was able to get the ship to the dock. In fact, the city was so thankful that he was able to break through finally that they actually gave him a medal. And he actually used that major experience to help design the major car ferries that became um, effective at ice breaking on the Great Lakes. And we'll talk about that in a second. And here again, this is what it would have looked like. They had one ship going the other direction, so that they could back up easily and be able to use the propeller to chew up ice as they go through it. All right, so car ferries. Now, on Lake Superior, we didn't have many car ferries operating, but on Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and the other Great Lakes, they were very much needed by the railroads, and especially when it comes to major places like the Straits of Mackinac, which didn't have a bridge until the 1950s. They had railroads and these car ferries that would bring the cars from those railroads back and forth across the lake. Because these car ferries had to operate all the time, they had to deal with the winter and the ice. And in the Straits of Mackinac, the ice is actually usually pretty bad every year, because of how narrow the straits are. And as a result, they need car ferries need to be developed so they could handle the ice. And Captain Boynton was involved in the creation of the Mackinac Transportation Company, which ran the wanted car ferries running between St. Ignace and Mackinac City. And it was because of his experiences at Alpena that they decided, with their car ferries, that they would put a propeller at the front. So again, they would be able to back the car ferry up so that it could go after breaking through ice by ramming it and by helping chew up the ice. So this car ferry in particular is super famous. The Chief Wawatam, built in 1911. Um, and it was famously operating between St. Ignace and Mackinac City for many years through, I believe, the 1980s. Besides that front propeller, some other things to know about this particular vessel is that it was very powerful. It had three different steam engines that operated it, which came up to about 4,500 horsepower total. One of those engines powered the propeller up front, and then the two others kind of propelled the vessel forward. Um, And the Chief Wawadam and other car ferries were so effective at icebreaking that in the early 1900s, the Russian Empire actually sent representatives to the United States to look at these car ferries on the Great Lakes so that they could have better designs for their own car ferries and other ferries that they were building for the Arctic. There were designs that were used from our car ferries on the Great Lakes by other nations that famously dealt with ice, like Russia, Finland, etc., Sweden. And because these vessels were so effective at breaking ice, the Lake Carriers Association actually hired these ships privately to help get the shipping season moving at the start of the year if there was really bad ice on Whitefish Bay and that sort of thing. So that concept was taken next by the Coast Guard, which during World War II they needed an effective icebreaker to help ships move in the wintertime because of the war demand. So one of the ships that was created as a result of that was the original Mackinac in 1944. And again, we see that classic up front propeller that was built that would help, again, the vessel back up and ram large pieces of ice. And with the Mackinac, it actually the vessel became even more powerful than the Chief Wawadam. The total horsepower for the entire ship was about 12,000 horsepower, and it had six different 10-cylinder engines to operate. It was literally built as the heavy icebreaker, one of the best probably in the world at the time for many years for breaking through heavy ice. And it was such effective at its job that it was used for many years up until 2006. It was retired, and today it's a museum in Mackinac City. So I've been meaning to visit it. I hope I get a chance sometime in the near future. But it's very interesting that how this ship is just so famous with all the different crews around the lakes, and they were always kind of the help to come and get them through with convoys, as you can see in this photo with the ships that are following behind it. So now that we have heavy icebreakers on the Great Lakes that can get vessels through um, with Coast Guard units, the shipping companies actually attempted to see how far into the winter they could actually operate. And this was kind of a famous period in the late 60s through the 70s where they experimented with winter navigation. And this was mostly um, driven by a couple different things, mostly with the development of taconite pellets for iron ore shipments. Um, that actually allowed vessels to more operate in the winter. So the original iron ore that was mined was a powdery clay-like material that would freeze very easily. But taconite is hard and doesn't have much moisture in it, so with the taconite pellets, ships would be able to load that cargo without it freezing. And then U.S. Steel finally decided in 1967 that they wanted to see how effective it would be if they tried to operate their ships almost year round. And again, they pretty much did this experiment all the way through 1978. And what they did is they had the Soo locks stay open really late into the year so that their ships could get through. Um, so the whole experiment itself kind of ended with mixed results. Basically, it's kind of the reason why we have the shipping season close on mid-January every year. Although U.S. Steel did benefit from operating later in the year, some of the winters could be really costly with ships being damaged. A lot of the shipping companies weren't that interested in trying to push their ships through the ice, risking all sorts of costs to that. And then there were also environmental concerns with if you kept ice from forming on the rivers, there were habitats and erosion issues that environmentalists were worried about. So that's kind of why we have the mid January to late March period for when ships don't operate. Then finally, we get to the modern heavy icebreaker on the lakes, the Mackinac, the second Mackinac that was built in 2005. And instead of the bow propeller that was on the old Mackinac, they have these azipod units that replace the bow propeller. And these propellers can actually turn 360 degrees, so that allows the ship to easily back up instead of needing a bow propeller to do that. And it serves out of Sheboygan, Michigan, but you can find it pretty much anywhere in the Great Lakes. The last few years, we've seen them several times helping break our harbor out in the springtime. But typically, they're not needed if the winter isn't all that bad and the ice coverage isn't too bad in the winter time, or in the springtime, rather. So, based off of what you just saw here, what are kind of three different things do you think that make a good icebreaker? Think about kind of the characteristics of the different ships that you saw. What kind of things do you think you need on a vessel to make it a good icebreaker? Think about what I was talking about with um, being able to back up and go again, that kind of thing. Any ideas out there? Power, weight, and size. Yes. So Steve kind of hit it immediately. What you need are kind of basically you need a powerful engine or engines, and that rather um, than a normal ship, so that it can actually push through um, uh, thick ice. You also, well, I didn't talk about this too much, but you need a pointed bow or sharp edge so that it can actually, that assists with kind of wedging through ice and the ability to back up quickly, as I keep talking about. What you see there is kind of a classic windrow ice situation where storms will break up ice and push it all together and make it really thick, and that can be really problematic for ships to get through. So, Operation Taconite, that is what the Coast Guard calls their operation every year when they start to do ice breaking on Lake Superior and the other Great Lakes. And Operation Taconite is called that because of the iron mines that are trying to have their product delivered to the steel mills on Lower Lake Michigan and to Lake Erie. And the Coast Guard has had the position where they help those ships get through so that they can deliver their stuff to the steel mills before the shipping season ends for the year. And helping to keep those steel mills operating is really important for not just the Great Lakes economy, but for the nation because a lot of our steel here in the U.S. is made on the Great Lakes. So if anything happens with them not getting enough material to produce steel, that can cause major problems in the economy because that steel is used for construction, auto, or car manufacturing, appliances, anything you can think of. So it's become kind of a national, federal priority to help those ships get through to the steel mills at the end of the season. And with Operation Taconite, the Coast Guard has a couple different ships besides the major Mackinac icebreaker. There are smaller vessels. On the left, they have several of these 140-foot bay class icebreaking tugs. What's cool about these guys is that they have a bubbler system along the vessel that um, helps break up the ice with these forced air bubbles that come up along the sides. It's pretty cool to see if you've never seen it before. They can break 20 inches of ice without having to back up and ram, or they can break up to 3 feet or more by ramming. And then on the right, which we have locally, are the Juniper class buoy tenders. These guys are a bit bigger at 225 feet, and they have more engine power. They don't necessarily have that bubbler system, but they have a lot more weight to them. They're a lot bigger, and they're able, like the Mackinac, they're very maneuverable, and they can ram through 3 feet of ice or more, depending on conditions. So with Operation Taconite, the Coast Guard provides three different types of assistance. The main type of assistance that you see pretty regularly is track maintenance, which means that they are going over the federal channels in the harbors or in the shipping lanes and basically creating a track for the ships for the future. Typically, what happens before the shipping season starts here in our harbor, the Coast Guard starts to do that track maintenance a few weeks before everything starts up, so the ships will have an easy time starting off the shipping season. And then there are escorts and convoys. A few of those have happened already this year with ice buildup, especially the other day I saw on Lake Erie, there were a couple of convoys coming in and out of the rivers um, there. And that's when you have the Coast Guard directly break a path for several ships at a time. And if any of those ships get stuck, the Coast Guard can kind of stop and go back and help break them out, that sort of thing, which gets to the direct assistance part, which is where a Coast Guard ship will kind of do circles around a freighter, which will help loosen things up so they can move again. All right, so a couple videos here to show you guys from what I've been able to experience the last few years getting on board a Coast Guard ship to see what's like ice breaking. So here are a few videos here. And try to pay attention to, I'll be asking a few different questions here at the end of each video, which type of assistance you think is happening. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're watching here quick. So that was in early 2020. The ice was pretty thick that year, just before the pandemic hit. So it's just kind of cool to see what it looks like at the front of the bow as you're going through. And I think ice in the harbor was about a foot thick at the time, but it was already melting, so it was pretty easy to get through. Um, and then another quick one. This is on the bridge of the Alder. Okay. Oh, all right, just 1 second here. Sorry about that. Sounds like there wasn't any sound with it. You might have to go. Um, I guess the sound isn't quite as important, just to kind of see the visuals. But based off of what you saw, um, what do you think? What kind of ice breaking assistance was the Alder giving in those videos? Just based off of what you saw, were they giving track maintenance help? Were they doing a convoy? Were they directly assisting ships? What do you think? Tracks, yep. So this one might not have been super clear, but you didn't really see any other ships in there. They were literally just going through the harbor early on in the season and creating the paths that would be needed when the shipping season started. Um, there was one vessel you could kind of see in the background, but they were actually in for winter layup. Um, and again, this starts up at usually a few weeks before the shipping season. Now, these ones, I'm pretty sure the sound doesn't work on, but let's look at these. This is from earlier this shipping season, where we were on the Hollyhock as they were breaking ice. Okay, and then one more. This is all happening outside the superior entry of our harbor. Alrighty, so based off of those videos, this is a lot more obvious. What kind of assistance do you think they were giving as they were breaking through the ice? Based off of what you saw in those two videos, what kind? Track maintenance, convoys, and or direct assistance. Right, yep, Michelle. So in especially in this last video, we were actually giving direct assistance to two different ships. And the Superior Entry one you can see leaving, and the other one is anchored here. And we were doing a path for them to leave, and then for these guys to come in. So because of how thick the ice was just outside the entry. Alrighty. And that kind of concludes the presentation. We'll get to questions in a second, but I think Michelle is going to give us some more information here before we get to any questions you guys have.
Just a second, let me get my screens sorted out here. Okay, so while everybody has a couple minutes to enter some questions for Scott in the chat, I'll run over real quick our status at our visitor centers right now. The Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center in Duluth is going to be starting its winter hours starting January 16th. They have a cell phone tour that's always available outside, and a virtual tour of their museum is available online. And there's an online gift shop which helps support their cooperating association, which helps us do programs like this. At the Soo, our visitor center is closed until May 1st, and we will have an open house March 25th, our annual kickoff of the navigation season and celebration. And we do have online information sheets, and all of our exhibits are available online for downloading. Posted a link to those in the chat. And with that, I will see if we have any questions for Scott. And I will just also add in that if anyone is in the Mackinac City area in Michigan, the Coast Guard Cutter Mackinac, the original Mac or the Mighty Mac, is an amazing vessel. It's a one of a kind on the entire Great Lakes, and it was really purpose built during World War II to support the war effort and the economy in the region. And I'm really proud that before I came to the Corps, I was actually the president of that organization that helped save that ship. And it is an amazing vessel, and I hope everyone has a chance to visit it at some time. And I do have a quick question for you, Scott. Have you been able to visit the spar yet? That's the newest ice-breaking asset on the Great Lakes.
No, I haven't been able to. They just got here last early this shipping season last March. So, but my understanding is all the alder, the hollyhock, the spar, they're all kind of the same. My understanding too is that the spar was up in Alaska, I believe, for from when it was built in like 2001 or two up through just this last year. So it was kind of interesting to see how the Coast Guard is moving vessels around with the alder basically went to another spot like the spar did, and switching between salt and fresh water, so that the hulls of those vessels last longer, I think. But this is the first winter that we've had the spar operating, so it's still pretty new. Hopefully, I can get in contact with the Coast Guard this next spring, and maybe we'll be able to go along for another ice breaking trip, because it's just really neat to see. And it's they have to go out several, I don't know how many times. The Hollyhock, when they were here, I felt like they were constantly out helping with the ships coming in and out. So it's cool to see.
And another note too, for those of you who attend the Virtual Visitor Center every month, you may have been expecting to see a program about the spar today, but unfortunately they are needed out in the harbor breaking ice. But we do hope to have a program focused on the spar by a Coast Guard member on board later this year, maybe in April, depending on how ice goes and where they are needed to be. And I don't see any questions, so I'm going to once again promote our program next month, which I think will be very interesting. We're going to have a conversation with Mark Barker, the president of Interlake Maritime Services. We'll have a chance to talk to him about his role in this family-owned shipping company and his progress through that company, what it was like to grow up in that culture, and also about the new and exciting things that the company is tackling, like car ferries and tour boat companies. And we did get a question. It was actually someone from, I believe, the SPAR, asking what are
Oh
some
boy.
differences between Canada Coast Guard cutters and the U.S. Coast Guard cutters.
So, I think Michelle, you know this information too, but my understanding is that the Canadian Coast Guard vessels are actually underneath their Department of Fisheries, which is kind of a big difference. More our Coast Guard is more kind of military based, and because of that, there are crews on those vessels that don't rotate as much. They stay on their vessels for a lot longer time. So there's some interesting differences there. In recent years, there's been I forgot in the presentation too that there's an agreement between the Canadian and U.S. Coast Guards to help with icebreaking around the Great Lakes. Um, but is there anything else that you wanted to add on that, Michelle, that you
You know,
know?
one difference that I understand is most of the crews on Canadian icebreakers, that's at least their licensed personnel, that is their career. In
Hmm.
the U.S. Coast Guard, there's a tendency for a lot of cross training and cross kind of assignments. So you may be doing, law enforcement off the coast of Florida. Then you might end up ice breaking out of Sector Sioux in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And then you might end up on an aids to navigation vessel working in Mississippi or Ohio rivers. And so American Coast Guard crews, multiple skills, and Canadian Coast Guard crews often a little more specialized. It's just a different approach to how they want to operate their specific systems.
Hmm.
And I'll have to make some friends with Canadian Coast Guard personnel. Maybe we'll get them for a program someday.
Yeah, that would be cool because I think it would be interesting to see all those differences and what they experience with operations. And they don't ever come. I know you guys get to see them sometimes, but we don't ever get to see the Canadian Coast Guard vessels here. So,
And they're asking how loud. I think part of that might depend on the vessels. I know Scott, as well as I, have had a chance to ride along on several different icebreakers, and I remember on the original Mackinac, throughout the entire ship, it was like this slow rumble, and it was
hmm.
actually kind of soothing. I don't know how you would feel living on board listening to it all the time, but as a passenger after lunch, sitting in the officer mess, it was really quite nice for napping. Of course,
Hmm.
the Coast Guard people didn't have that benefit.
Yeah,
But out on deck, it was quite loud.
wasn't the Mackinac, the original Mac, built with cork in its hull to help deal with noise and that kind of thing? I thought I read that. Is that true?
I if I knew that, I don't remember it anymore. It's one of the
Hmm.
costs of getting old.
Yeah. But I've heard like all sorts of stories from old Coast Guardsmen that would come in talking about, operating on the Mac and it's still being louder than heck getting through big windrows of ice and stuff like that. So, like you say, it kind of depends on the ship, I guess, and what you're doing.
And I will say, I got to go on a Bay class cutter once, and we did that backing and ramming. You got to
Hmm.
kind of hold on. You got to be braced for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so thank you for those questions. And once again, next month, February 2nd, that should be a really enlightening and interesting program with Mark Barker. I've had the pleasure of meeting him several times, very engaging fellow, and clearly an expert on Great Lakes shipping from an angle of it many of us don't get to experience. And in the meantime, there you can see all the different ways to get a hold of us. I will post in the link to our YouTube channel. So if you do want to check out this program or share it with someone else, or you're just interested in checking out some of our other programs, we have done all sorts of programs about all different maritime themes and shipwrecks and the Corps of Engineers. There's a lot of really great stuff there. I'm having trouble grabbing my link. There we go. Sorry, folks. So there we have a link to our YouTube channel. And thank you for taking some time out of your day today to join us. And also thank you to Scott again. No one would have been able to tell, but Scott had very short notice to pull this program together because the spar was needed elsewhere to keep boats and the economy moving. So Scott stepped in and put together an excellent program for us. Thank you, Scott.
And thank you to everyone who showed up and those who
Hope to see
hopefully
you
look
next
at it
month.
on YouTube later. Yep.
Thank you.